Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of this series where I rank and review just about every level from Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, Sekiro and last but not least, Elden Ring. I covered the first 50 levels in part 1, going all the way from the horrendous Memory of the Old Iron King at number 147 to the pretty decent Aldius Keep at 98, but in this video we're going to be going from number 97 all the way to 48, meaning that the quality of the levels we'll be discussing today are far higher, though the absolute best of the best will be reserved for part 3 of course. Due to the nature of this series, it's really not totally necessary to watch part 1 to understand this video, it's not that complex, but I did go through all the criteria related stuff in the intro for part 1, which I would recommend people check out if they haven't already, just so we're all on the same page about what the hell I'm even talking about here. Apart from that, I see no reason to extend this intro much longer, so before I get stuck right into level number 97, please allow me to give a massive thank you to my kind patrons for supporting the channel. And with all that being said, let's just get the hell into it. Here at number 97 I have the Memory of Vamar. I did of course have another memory level from Dark Souls 2 exactly 50 entries ago with the Memory of the Old Iron King, which I do in fact consider to be the single worst Soulsborne level. But comparatively, the Memory of Vamar is far more interesting and worth engaging with. Just like with the Memory of Jay and the Memory of Oro, this level is accessed after interacting with one of those giant tree things in the Forest of Fallen Giants, taking you back in time to when the giants were invading Drangleic. The first entity you see upon entering, however, is not an enemy, but instead Captain Drummond, who is just one of many of Dark Souls 2's fantastic NPCs, though I guess I was in a hurry back when I recorded this footage, because I just button mashed my way through all his dialogue, the disrespect. Cool thing about this guy is that while you can get the Drangleic set and sword very early on in the game, interacting with Captain Drummond here is the only way to get the helm to complete the set. Just ahead though, you come face to, well, whole with some actual giants. These things have really weird designs, but I do like the way they look, I think. They're kind of like a weird mashup of Diamond Weapon from FF7 and the Iron Giant from FF10. Thankfully, they're pretty easy to kill Thankfully, they're pretty damn easy to kill though. I've got a real appreciation for levels where you just get to stand back and watch enemies attack each other, where you can relax for half a minute to watch the carnage unfold, and so I love this part with the Ironclads, Royal Infantry, Giants and Giant Warriors battling it out while fireballs rain down from the sky, though you can't relax for too long when in memories thanks to the time limit. This isn't a massive level or anything, and the main goal really is to just barrel through it so as to grab the memory of a giant at the end to help out with the King Vendrick fight, but it's just presented really well, and the giants make for very cool enemies, especially when it's not me who has to fight them. Ashen Reservoir is quite a unique level compared to almost any other level in this list because it actually has 3 different states depending on when you arrive here. It does of course act as the game's tutorial level after Emma drops Wolf a note from above, after which you have to make it to the Moonview Tower to reunite with Kuro, though gameplay wise there's nothing that awesome here. The hardest challenge is simply a duel with
Shigenori Yamauchi.
If you come back later on though after getting nailed by Genichiro and meeting the sculptor, it's a much more engaging level with lots of enemies in awkward spots, heavily encouraging the use of stealth, especially for the big fat baby guys with the mallets. In particular though, once again the Moonview Tower is the main POI of interest, or rather the dude lurking outside it. 7 Ashen Spears,
Shikibu Toshikatsu Yamauchi.
I love how the level is laid out in a way where you're encouraged to take the same cliffside route as you did in the tutorial level so as to creep up behind him for a stealth takedown, because this mini-boss can be seriously difficult if you take him on too early, though he's also a brilliant opponent and does a lot to make Ashen Reservoir so memorable for me. But then, if you're following any ending other than the Shura one, you return back to the reservoir at the very end, now with everything ablaze with the fires of the Interior Ministry. Standing sentinel shortly before the secret door leading to the final fight with Ishin's Sword Saint, however, is another 7 Ashen Spears mini-boss, as well as a samurai type mini-boss, heavily encouraging the use of the puppeteer ninjutsu technique, because Christ knows how the hell you're supposed to beat these dudes any other way. If I was just judging Ashen Reservoir as a tutorial level, I'd have placed it somewhat less favourably in this list. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but rather because there's nothing special about it. But the way it's reused is very well done, the way the danger level is increased with every iteration. The ruin-strewn precipice is just one of 4 possible ways to reach the Altus Plateau. You can ascend up the Grand Lift of Dectus after collecting both halves of the Dectus Medallion, warp into Leyndell from the Deeproot Depths portal near the Prince of Death's corpse, get transported to Mount Gelmir from the Abductor Virgin at the bottom of Rhea Lucaria Academy, and then make your way to Altus Plateau from there. Or you can say screw all that convoluted nonsense, I'll just journey to the far north of Liurnia and then ascend up the ruin-strewn precipice, which is exactly what I myself did on my very first playthrough for some reason. The idea of this level is very simple. It's simply a climb from the base of Liurnia up to the top, but instead of one large elevator to take you the whole way, gotta do most of the climbing yourself. Navigation wise, the ruin-strewn precipice is very straightforward, or should I say straight up, largely because for the most part you're moving vertically rather than laterally. It's just a question of finding the next set of stairs or ladder, past those bat creatures, including the weird singing ones. The main thing I like about this level really is the views. It looks and feels fantastic, the way you rise above Liurnia, spotting the highway from above before the ground becomes enshrouded by the region's characteristic violet mists as you ascend closer to the golden surface. I also love the scene that greets you at the top and how much less glorious it is when compared to the lift of Dectus route. Instead of a grand lift guarded by guardian golems, you simply have a bunch of overturned caravans and a few omens. It's really not that difficult to get both halves of the Dectus Medallion, but I really appreciate how they added this alternate method of getting up to the top, and I especially appreciate the excellent views along the way. This is the 3rd memory level from Dark Souls 2 that I've covered so far, though it has far more in common with the memory of Vamar than the memory of the Old Iron King. Again, you are placed right in the thick of the action when the giants from across the sea launch their decisive attack on Drang Lake, wiping out scores of royal soldiers and the occasional ironclad. Witnessing the melee is frantic and fun, though the level seems that bit bigger and more complex than the memory of Vamar. I also love the part near the start where you can walk right by the non-hollowed versions of the infantry without them attacking, and even use a Pharos Lockstone here for an amazing reward. Hey, what the hell? Again, there's not really a huge incentive to actually engage with any of the enemies because the goal really is to just reach the dead giant at the end to get its soul, but even if I choose not to join in with the action is still going on despite my presence, which I think's pretty awesome. Not the most ambitious level in the game, but it's fast, intense and fun. So I like the Profaned Capital and always have, but funnily enough I actually used to think the level was about half the size that it really was. After battling through those terrifying stone gargoyle creatures and making it to the bonfire where good old Gilligan McIrish makes his morbid cameo, from here I just thought the rest of the level consisted of this section where you try to get down to the bottom here, past the fireballs and more gargoyles, and then into the arena where Yorm awaits, past those knife-wielding maiden enemies. However, about 4 playthroughs in, I realised that there's a whole other optional part to the level. It's just really easy to miss. I guess you're not missing a massive amount here, and for those folk who absolutely cannot abide poison, or should I say toxic swamps, maybe it's better off hidden, but personally I was delighted to get here, especially once I saw the bizarre hand hippo things. Awesome design for an enemy. Even with this extra section, the Profaned Capital doesn't feel quite as substantial as it perhaps could have, especially when compared to the game's other Lord of Cinder levels, but it has an amazing atmosphere and a great sense of verticality, especially at this narrow stone bridge section. It looks so ominous down here, with all the jailer type enemies huddled around and the treasure filled rooms at either side of the fog wall. The stone gargoyles are a brilliant element of the level too, with these things of course being something of a precursor to the gargoyles from Elden Ring. You see them again later in the Grand Archives, but the ones here are headless, which I think really ties into the whole profaned aspect of the level. And now for the first Demon Souls level in quite a while, with the second level of Stonefang, the Tunnel City. This is a big freaking level, or at least FromSoft designed it in such a way where it really feels that way. Its size doesn't come from any sort of wide, open layout though, but rather from its dense and sometimes confusing networks of tunnels, both wide and narrow. Right from the get-go, the path branches off into 2, and from there things get even more confusing, though it doesn't necessarily have to be. If you know exactly where you're going, you can just run to the right and adroitly jump down the perilous wooden platforms, then sprint directly to the boss room past the magma-spewing worms, though if you've a mind for exploring, there's a surprising amount to see and do here. Unless you've already made his unpleasant acquaintance in the ritual path at the Shrine of Storms, Patches is located in this impressively large section with all the bear bugs, and of course he tries to get you killed here. Good god, they made Patches so ugly here. He was never a looker in any of the other games, don't get me wrong, but here it irritates me just to look at his uncanny facial animations. I kind of hate the way some of the characters look in the Demon's Souls remake. Although I do find the scale and layout of the tunnel city to be impressive, that doesn't mean I don't find it to be rather convoluted in place, particularly in the very tight tunnel section with the large bear bugs. I like the idea of this part, of you desperately trying to navigate through this confusing, constricting network of mines, and just how when you think you might be making some progress, you end up in that bit with even more lava, but it's kind of a bloody drag to actually play through it, especially if a damn bear bug gets in your way. If you have magic or some sticky white stuff, you're golden, but if not, have fun spending 5 straight minutes attacking it with your borderline useless weapon. Now, ISFK's clinic really isn't the largest or most ambitious level in the game, but even so I like it quite a bit. Like several areas from other games I've already covered, it's a tutorial level of sorts, though the actual explorable area is very small at the beginning. It's really just 2 small rooms and a larger one for you to try out the basic controls, like pressing triangle to accidentally waste a blood vial because you're too used to the Dark Souls controls. Of course, your very first combat encounter here is pretty legendary with how merciless it is, especially because you start off with no weapons, though that can be used to your advantage if you're clever, when you consider that the unarmed charge attack is the fastest one in the game, making it pretty easy to go in for a follow-up visceral attack from behind, because the critical attacks in this game are not tied to your weapon, they're tied to your stats. As a wee tutorial level, it's pretty great. There may not be any actual navigation involved, but Bloodborne is such a delicious looking game right from the start that it simply doesn't matter. You can choose to return to ISFK's clinic much later on though, if you manage to spot the quite easily missable passage from the Forbidden Woods back to central Yharnam, this time to the upper floor to see all the dark, weird secrets that the ISFK imposter had been hiding. For one, you've got a celestial emissary chilling here who can be deduced to be the true ISFK. We know that these bizarre blue beings are made from humans by the dead body of one on the table who has a human hand. If you come here after defeating Rom though, the imposter is in the throes of some insanity-inducing transformation, giggling and rigid on the gurney. Awesome moment with brilliant dialogue, and the whole atmosphere of the clinic is on another level. It's really creepy but in a more subtle way compared to the blood and beasts found throughout the rest of Yharnam. Hardly the most complex level in the game, but I really like beginning my hunts here and then returning later to explore its darker recesses and to grab the Cainhurst summons, can't forget that. And right after ISFK's clinic, here at number 90 we have another tutorial level, with Dark Souls 3's Cemetery of Ash. As far as tutorial levels go, this one's pretty ideal. It's not too difficult, but you absolutely can die here, especially if you're a bit unprepared for how quick and aggressive the game's enemies are when compared to the comparatively slower combat of Dark Souls 1 and 2. It starts off with a nice wee section for you to traverse around, picking off enemies and collecting items, including the Ashen Estus flasks, which was of course brand new to Dark Souls 3, and then repeated in Elden Ring, which essentially had an identical healing system. The Cemetery of Ash does something I love in a tutorial level, in giving you the optional opportunity to take on something far more formidable than the rest of the enemies here, with a wee side path leading to the ravenous crystal lizard. It's really not all that difficult to beat, but it's the kind of thing that will probably intimidate the hell out of an absolute beginner, encouraging them to come back later, whereas a cocky Dark Souls veteran already knows the deal here. Yeah, I think I know what I'm doing. Even after nailing Udex Gundyr, the area afterwards does much the same thing, where you can fight the Katana dude near Firelink for his Uchi Katana if you feel up to the task. I'm not saying that I love the Cemetery of Ash as a regular level, otherwise I'd have placed it a bit higher, but as a tutorial level, it's very good. It provides an appropriate level of challenge, presents good opportunities for navigation and item hunting, and gives you a couple of optional combat challenges for some decent early game rewards. At the end of the luminescent lakes of the Shrine of Amana with its armies of warlocks, priestesses and aberrations lies the Undead Crypt, a place of darkness where light itself is forbidden. Things start out hot and heavy in this place with Cyan's Knights, witches and one of the sickest enemies in the game with its Reeves and Orma's Great Shield weapon. And if you played the rather excellent Lies of P recently, you might have recognised one of the enemies from that game, which was basically ripped right out of the Undead Crypt here. Enemies aside for a second though, with darkness being such a thematic focus of the level, you'd think it'd be a bit more, well, dark. But it's really not that bad in that regard, certainly not when compared to places like the Gutter or even No Man's Wharf. In fact, I rarely feel much of a need to bust out the torch, even a single time while wandering through its gloomy halls and corridors, because most of the time you can simply see enough of what you need to see. Like quite a few of Dark Souls 2's levels, the Undead Crypt does introduce its own unique quirks, like having ghosts sometimes extending out of the very walls to spook you, like in Silent Hill 4, minus the escalator. The level's most distinctive feature, however, is the bell mechanic, where if you or an enemy hit one of those large ominous bells, an ominous ringing will begin, causing some ominous hooded enemies to appear ominously from the ominous shadows. Too spooky for me, mate. Although things can get unfeasibly chaotic in these situations, I have to admit that I kind of love it, because sometimes it's difficult not to inadvertently strike one of the bells when you're dealing with another enemy, especially if you're trying to stop another enemy hitting one of those very bells. It's good fun, though it can get out of hand. The same thing is done in the final large hall just before the fantastic boss fight with Velstadt, which can make taking down the Cyan Knights and Dragon Rider particularly problematic, though to be honest 9 out of 10 times I just run past them to the fog wall. Although I'm very critical of the score of the First Sin version of Dark Souls 2, I do like how they added a Dragon Rider here because it is one of my favourite enemies in the game, and there used to just be a ton of Cyan Knights here, which if anything was even more of a pain in the arse. Of all 7 games featured in this series, by far the most common appearance in the first 50 entries from 147 to 98 was Dark Souls 2. But we're past all that now, and more onto the region of the list where the levels range from decent to great. And so for number 88, I have the Huntsman's Copse. This level lies pretty damn close to Majula, though it's totally inaccessible from the start due to the path being blocked off by the circular contraption, but after speaking to / killing Lycia, you can pass through and onto a level that I consider to be pretty decent, maybe? Aesthetically it's quite distinct, being a dark forest, though it's somewhat more pleasant and interesting to look at compared to the shaded woods, where the dominant colour scheme seems largely inspired by the colour and texture of puke. Mind you, there's still no shortage of poison in Huntsman's Copse, though rather than having swamps of the stuff, it's now sprayed down in a fine mist from giant tree-dwelling butterflies, which I guess is preferable. It's a decently expansive level, with good potential for exploration, particularly in the more mid-portion, though these bandit-type enemies can be very difficult to deal with, especially if you're trying to rush through the level, because they chase you, same with the sickle dudes and the dogs. The section afterwards changes it up by becoming far less open and more path-based, though you can take the cave route populated by skeletons and necromancers. There's a bonfire right at the start here, but the game pulls a bit of a dick move that I don't really approve of by putting it behind a locked gate. The key does lie beyond in the actual level, but you know what might help me to deal with the actual level? The bonfire. It's not like you need it for the boss or anything, it's just the skeleton lords. Would have been cooler if they'd hidden the key in a previous part of the level rather than having it further ahead, but hey, no big deal. I'll be honest, I find it kind of difficult to talk about Huntsman's Copse because I just don't consider it to be all that interesting. It's decent enough, with a decent capacity for exploration, and even an optional section leading to the Undead Purgatory where the Executioner's chariot awaits, but I don't love it. Nonetheless, as I've said twice in the last 20 seconds, it is indeed decent, and so I guess I'll put it here at number 88. As with a great many Elden Ring levels, Caria Manor is completely optional and quite easily missable, unless you're going for the Age of the Stars ending of course. It's not that the structure is in any way subtle, because it's sure as hell not, but rather, Liurnia is absolutely massive. There's just so much ground to cover in the region that it's hard as hell to explore everywhere in the one playthrough. But at the northwestern tip of Liurnia awaits Caria Manor, though E.G. the giant blacksmith tries to warn you away from the place with his soothing Welsh tones. And no wonder, with the magical snare laid out to vaporise any would-be tarnished invaders like us. As for the interior, well, it somehow manages to be even more densely misted and atmospheric than the rest of Liurnia, but the difference is that instead of the comparatively more anthropomorphic creatures inhabiting the rest of the region, here the dominant life forms are the finger creepers, lying in wait below the surface of the soil like trapdoor spiders. Finger creepers is such a perfect name for these enemies too, because they do indeed creep about and they are extremely creepy. The way they flick and grab, there's something kind of perverse about it. Stay away from me. For as mystical and magical as this large garden section may seem, due to the concentration of finger creepers here, it's really not an area I like to stick around in. I'll tend to have a poke around for a few items, but you need to move slowly through here, otherwise it's all too easy to have a trail of hands running after you. I also don't love the higher up section directly afterwards, because the game just throws so many of these rare Lucaria soldier spirits at you. They're not difficult to beat or anything, it's just that they slow down the process of actually moving through the level in a way that isn't very enjoyable. The final section leading up to the fight with Royal Knight Loretta is great though. These dire wolves are a real bitch to fight, but at least they don't have albinoric archers riding on top of them like they later do in the consecrated snowfields. Also, this Troll Knight is one of my favourite enemy designs in the game, and on my most recent playthrough I actually went with a strength magic build specifically to use this sword. It's so cool looking. To be honest, I kinda think what makes Caria Manor that little bit special is how it leads up to the Three Sisters at the top, where you get to first meet Ranni. The level itself isn't great fun to actually move through, but the way it presents itself is absolutely outstanding, both from the outside and within. Aha, the Forbidden Woods, one of, if not the, most expansive level in the game, though the Nightmare Frontier might just have it beaten, I'm not too sure. After nailing our waifu, Vicar Amelia, the password to gain entry through the door in Cathedral Ward is learned, and after passing through the intricate yet comprehensible architecture and layout of Cathedral Ward, you enter into a level far more intricate but significantly less comprehensible, the Forbidden Woods. You will get lost here. To be fair though, things do start out reasonably coherent. The early enemies are primarily your human types already seen throughout central Yharnam, and there's even a village here which you can pass directly through, or go over, or you can just say screw it and take the cave back to central Yharnam from here. This is also where you have your first encounter with Patches the Spider, where he gifts you with the Tonsil Stone. Super creepy interaction too, though you're just having this conversation with an entity you cannot quite make out in the middle of this mad village in the middle of nowhere. As dangerous and ravenous as the village is though, it's beyond it where things get so much more twisted, gnarled and downright serpentine in more ways than one. There are snakes everywhere here, And as far as I know, these smaller snake balls will infinitely respawn from their spawn points, ready to lash out and envenomate. Though it's the big ones that are the real terror of the woods, the big balls. Even these enemies who initially seem anthropomorphic and understandable transform nearly entirely when you get closer, and in the more remote reaches of the woods you have small gangs of celestial emissaries, though it's entirely possible to completely miss whole sections of this level because, enemies aside, it can be seriously difficult to navigate. Again, there's the Nightmare Frontier issue where everything kinda looks the same, and so even if you do find the right path in the direction of the boss, that doesn't mean you're going to find it so easily the next time round. However, you will also notice that I've placed the Forbidden Woods a good deal higher in my rankings than the Nightmare Frontier, and that's because I think this level is exactly what it should be. It's supposed to be this chaotic, nearly alien place, long since abandoned by Yharnam. It's not meant to be straightforward. The enemies and overall atmosphere are meant to make you uncomfortable. You can say much the same sort of thing about the Nightmare Frontier to be fair, but I do enjoy this level just that bit more, and it can feel really satisfying to traverse once you start to work out which paths lead closer to the boss and which do not lead to the boss. I know a lot of people really can't stand the Forbidden Woods, which I absolutely understand, but I just have a bit too much appreciation for it to hate it. In stark contrast to the ethereal lunar splendour of Irithyll of the Boreal Valley lies the subterranean Irithyll dungeon, a place of darkness, torment and death. Dark Souls 3 pays heavy homage to the first Dark Souls game on many occasions, especially in Irithyll, but it also occasionally references Demon Souls, which is especially the case in this level with its resemblance to the Prison of Hope. It may not be quite as large or complex, but there are rows of cells and keys and terrifying jailers roaming around who you don't want to get seen by, though in this case you really don't want to get seen by one, thanks to their max HP draining capability. I'll be honest, this special ability of theirs sucks and I don't like it, but I also do like it because it ties in excellently to the oppressive history and atmosphere of the dungeon, but then I also don't like it because it can put you at death's door without even getting close to a jailer. But then I also do like it because of the atmosphere and stuff. But then it can be fairly challenging to get through this initial portion of the level with its cramped corridors, because if you do get your health drained and then you have a jailer rapidly moving towards you in that creepy shuffling way of theirs, then you have little to no room to manoeuvre, though in a later section there's a large hall with a silly number of them, guarding weird monstrosities, like these weird malformed dragon things who kinda resemble King Asiros. Although the layouts are completely different, I kinda look at Irithyll Dungeon similarly to how I look at the Forbidden Woods, who I just discussed. Is it a massive amount of fun to move through? Well, sometimes it isn't, but then sometimes it kind of is, especially when you find some new keys so you can go back to the row of cells at the start to see what it opens. And then you also have the less cramped sections where you can even get a good view of the profaned capital far below, not to mention the part with the sleeping giant where you have to blindly pick an opening to walk through and hope you don't land on its head. Well, it's nice to be back to Dark Souls 2 again, and especially nice that the level in question is the Shrine of Amana, because whereas nearly every level from this game that I've covered thus far has offended me in some way with its visuals, this one is significantly more attractive. I'm attracted to it. After defeating the Looking Glass Knight at the top of Drangleic Castle and then descending down the long elevator, this bright mystical location is probably the last thing most players expect to see, being very different in appearance to all levels thus far. Appearances can be deceiving though, because this might just be the most difficult level in the base game, though there are far more challenging places in the DLCs. The issue with Shrine of Amana is both the sheer number of enemies and their nature. The Amana priestesses fire homing magic from long range, and then you have the deceptively fast warlocks who hit like an absolute truck, and then there's the Amana aberrations who lurk under the water, barely visible from above, and to top it all off, it can be very challenging to quickly tell what parts of the ground are safe to walk on, especially in the heat of a combat moment when you're dodging leaping lizards and being pounded by problematic projectiles. I bought Dark Souls 2 at launch back on the Xbox 360, and apparently the original version of the Shrine of Amana was so tough and unfair that they patched it to make it easier, though I really don't remember much about the pre-patch version. As for the score of the Sin version, well, I don't much care for what they've done to the place. It actually seems to be a bit more merciful with the priestess and warlock density, but the aberrations are absolutely everywhere. There are way too many of them, like twice the number that there should be, in my opinion. Regardless, I still do like this level, and there are some cool moments and secrets, though I'd hate to come through here with a pure melee build. Bows are excellent in Dark Souls 2, and in many Scholar of the First Sin levels, they feel nearly necessary to pick off some enemies to make things more manageable, and this especially feels like the case in the Shrine of Amana. A couple of entries ago I mentioned Dark Souls 3's heavy homage to the first game in the trilogy, but the most significant callback arrives while climbing higher through Irithyll of the Boreal Valley after defeating Pontiff Sullivan. Very soon after this boss, you start seeing clear similarities, in particular the presence of flying buttresses from which Silver Knights fire arrows, and hey, you might even recognise aspects of the architecture here, but then you see that statue of Lord Gwyn from Dark Souls 1, beyond which awaited Dark Sun Gwendolyn in that game, and by this point, unless you're some sort of a dumb moron, a fool, the penny has dropped that you are in Anor Londo, with the large rotating elevator being the cherry on the cake. I know some folk got to the point where they were rolling their eyes a bit at all the Dark Souls 1 references in this game, but not me. I thought they were good, clean fun, and they did not detract from the Dark Souls 3 experience in the slightest. This game's sick as hell, with or without the callbacks. I loved climbing these stairs once again, and I especially loved the enhanced moveset of the Silver Knights, who now have additional lightning attacks thrown into their combos. As for the interior of the castle itself, sadly only a small portion of it is actually explorable. In fact, it's only really the Great Hall and then the old ONS boss arena where Aldrich now awaits, though there is also a sad cameo from the giant blacksmith who now lies dead and cold, clutching his giant's coal to be given to Andre. Of course, Anor Londo isn't supposed to be anywhere close to the level of its former glory now that Aldrich and his foul Deacons of the Deep have moved in, with the hall now being dark with sludge and guarded by one of the game's two deep accursed monsters. If I was to judge this level purely on its own merits with no appreciation for its place and status in the Dark Souls trilogy, I'd have placed it lower on my list, because in truth, there simply isn't that much to see here. But the feeling I got when I saw that Gwyn statue and when I ascended the lift and saw that Anor Londo text show up on the screen, well, if you'll pardon my language, it was pretty damn neat. I apologise for the foul language. For around the first half of your Bloodborne journey, for as violent, bloody and beastly as things absolutely are, for the most part they're still somewhat grounded, if you get what I mean. Yes, you're fighting beasts and serpents and blood-drunk hunters, but the horror throughout is quite conventional. But then you take on Rom, and the game takes on something of a different tone, right as you pass through the Moonside Lake and into that alternate realm, and then after the boss, when you're warped to the entrance to Yahar Ghul, because now the horror just got a fair bit less conventional. Now the sky is coloured an ungodly purple, there are eldritch horrors clinging to buildings, men and women are materialising out of blood in front of your eyes, terrifying cramped caskets roam the streets for fresh victims to crush, and the beasts here are significantly more twisted and nightmarish, appearing as monstrosities of stitched together rotten flesh as opposed to the more recognisable beasts of Central Yharnam or even Upper Cathedral Ward. The game really goes off the rails here, but in a great and interesting way, though that's not to say that I absolutely love traversing through Yahar Ghul. You can of course explore this area far earlier in the game if you got kidnapped, and the place absolutely has dark and creepy vibes, but its true face doesn't get exposed until after Rom is defeated. The lesser amygdalas are one of its most defining features, though one of these things was also to be found in Cathedral Ward much earlier, except invisible unless your insight was very high. As unsettling as their appearance in Yahar Ghul is, they certainly aren't just for show, with the first one doing that same portal crushing attack you have already seen, though the second one encountered further on doesn't fuck around at all and just blasts the ground with lasers, hitting both you and any enemies caught in the wake, and it's really, really sick. Although the first sections with the amygdalas and the villagers are great, I'm not the biggest fan of the second portion of the level. For a start, this part which puts you against 3 hunters at once is absolutely awful. Fighting even one hunter can be really difficult in this game, but 3 is just silly, especially when you can be one-shotted with a cannon or tiny tonitrus. Also, while the section outside looks exactly as awesome and nightmarish as it should, the cramped caskets can be a nightmare to fight, especially if there's more than one, which there absolutely is in places. More often than not, I just choose to run through this section to get to the one reborn, and the fact that there's not a hunter's lamp here makes it quite a pain. Even so, good level. And at number 81, we have the Depths, accessible from Lower Undead Burg, which then leads on to Blighttown. I've always found the Master Key aspect of Dark Souls 1 to be pretty interesting, because if you pick either it or just choose the Thief starting class, you can entirely skip Lower Undead Burg and the Depths, totally passing over the Capra Demon and the Gaping Dragon. I just find it a bit odd that FromSoft designed these levels and then gave you this easy option to just never even enter them if you don't want to, though personally I never skip the Depths, even though I can. I guess that this level was kind of a precursor to the subterranean shunning grounds from Elden Ring, but not quite as large and confusing, though you absolutely can still get confused down here, trust me. It's a dark, damp, dank sewer filled with rats, blobs, and at the deeper level, basilisks. Like many players, on my very first playthrough I didn't understand the danger posed by these things, and so just continued slashing and bashing with reckless abandon, and of course I got cursed, causing instant death complete with my max HP being slashed in half, and nor did I have a purging stone, so I had to trudge all the way back to the surface and back to the belfry at the Undead Parish to buy one from Oswald. The pain. The Depths certainly isn't the level that most folk imagine when they think of Dark Souls at its best, but it still has that distinctive Dark Souls flavour throughout its tunnels and gates, and there are some really cool moments, like freeing Laurentius from the cook, nailing the channeler at the top of the Gaping Dragon boss arena, and that bit with the giant rat, I guess. That's pretty good. We have another level from Dark Souls 3 here, and a big one too, the Road of Sacrifices. Just beyond the Undead Settlement, past the Outrider Knights, awaits the long road of sacrifices, at the end of which lies Aldrich's Cathedral of the Deep. The first section puts you against the deceptively ferocious Corvian enemies, though you can't avoid their violent transformation by just getting in there and killing them quick, though if you do allow them to sprout wings, these things are one of the hardest enemies in the game. For almost any enemy in the Souls games, if you choose to run away from them, you will get away, but the Corvians never stop chasing you, even on to the next portion of the level, the Crucifixion Woods. There's another wee Dark Souls reference here too, with a Man-Eater Mildred cameo who still has her signature butcher knife, though nearby there's a low-key fantastic other moment with a pair of rotten, hollowed dogs, one of whom is pregnant while its partner defends it. Great wee bit of environmental storytelling here, and very morbid too, as are most things in Dark Souls 3. As for the Crucifixion Woods portion, I actually do have a fundamental issue with it, and that is the sheer number of enemies here. Just like I said when discussing the Angel River back at number 110, I have a dislike of levels where there's a ton of weaker enemies roaming around, and the main culprit in this level is these crucifix carrying dudes. There's a lot of them, they don't feel enjoyable to fight, but rather they feel like a nuisance, impediments to prevent me from making my way through the level, rather than being interesting enemies to contend with. These dudes aren't everywhere though, because there's also a ruins section filled with sages, while the central portion is flooded with water at varying depths, and guarded by giant crabs, which are always a fun enemy, though if you try and cheese them by hitting them with ranged attacks from land, they just dive down below and restore literally all their health. Great. I also would have preferred if they didn't later respawn after being killed, because although their presence makes the act of walking around this large pond rather intense, it also makes it a bit of a pain in the arse, particularly in the sections where your mobility is limited. The Road of Sacrifices is a decent level with a lot of enemies and plenty of treasure to find, and it's a good size too, but there's just something about it that makes it feel a bit tedious to play through, and it's one of those things that's a bit difficult for me to put my finger on. At number 79, I have the Sunken Valley Passage, a wide open, expansive level of enormous statues, monkeys and, unfortunately, poison. At the end of the Sunken Valley Passage awaits the formidable Guardian Ape, who happens to be one of my all-time favourite bosses, but before that, got to get through the valley, which must be the most open level in the game. Places like Ashina Outskirts gives you great opportunities to utilise stealth and cunning, with many hiding spots and rooftops to grapple to, and then Ashina Castle has a much greater emphasis on rooftop traversal, over the samurai below and past the nightjars up above. But the Sunken Valley Passage is all about covering vast distances with big jumps and big grapples, from cliff to statue to monkey. The level is a true spectacle, and if it wasn't for Fountainhead Palace, this might just be the nicest looking place in the game, though the base of the valley isn't quite as easy on the eyes, with its poisonous swamp, and of course your mobility is hampered down here too. As for the main enemy of the area, as much as the monkeys are amusing to look at, I'm not the biggest fan of actually fighting them. Sekiro is at its best when it's putting you against formidable samurai, with extravagant, high damaging moves to learn, not when it has you fighting smaller beasts who are far easier to kill but greater in number. I have to mention the twin blade wielding monkeys at the base though, because these things look and feel incredible to fight, and this is the only place in the game where they appear too. The ones above have taken on certain human characteristics, with the way they even fire guns at you, but these things move and act in a far more uncanny manner, with a much greater degree of elegance and grace in their movements, and as such are far more engaging to fight. I kinda wish there were more of them in the game. Although I kinda praised the Sunken Valley Passage for its open environment, to be honest I also feel that this works a bit to its detriment. In denser levels I feel more of an urge to engage with the terrain and enemies, and to seek out any treasures tucked away in all the nooks and crannies, but here it's all too easy to just make a beeline over to the sculptor's idol near the Guardian Ape arena, past the gun-toting monkeys, and so for as pretty as it may be, I don't find this level to be super engaging. All the way back at number 146, we had a level from Dark Souls 2's Crown of the Sunken King DLC, that being the Cave of the Dead, but here we have another, significantly better level from that DLC, with Dragon's Rest, the area leading directly up to the fight with Alana, Squalid Queen, and then Sin, Slumbering Dragon. The aesthetic of the place is very similar to that of the Dragon Sanctum before it, except here there's a much greater focus on verticality. I remember when I entered into the area and looked directly downward and being impressed as hell at the layout. It just looks really freaking sick, and you need to closely examine where you want to drop down, kind of like with the Great Hollow from Dark Souls 1, except things aren't quite so precarious here. Although you can simply drop down to the bottom fairly quickly to take on the boss, there are opportunities for exploration here for treasure, and there's even a bonfire hidden behind an illusory wall which is pretty fiendish, I must say. I can never remember exactly what it is though, and so I usually just hug the walls, hammering the X button. Dragon's Rest is also where you encounter your very first Drakeblood Knights, sporting one of the coolest armour sets in the game, not to mention their powerful swords, and in fact, they even went and gave the Drakeblood Knights a cameo in Dark Souls 3 where they can be summoned in at Archdragon Peak. I don't really have much more to say about Dragon's Rest because it's not a massive level, but I really appreciate how it differs from every other level in the game with its vertical layout, and the Drakeblood Knights make for one of the game's sickest enemies. I spoke about the Consumed King's Garden way back at number 124, that being a level that I had some appreciation for but which had some elements which made getting through it feel like an overly hectic chore. But now we have the Untended Graves, a hidden level lying just beyond the garden, beyond an illusory wall, situated behind a chest, just at the entrance to the Great Hollow. However, in comparison to that level, the Untended Graves is a far grimmer and darker affair. This isn't really a brand new level, of course, because its layout is essentially a copy of the Cemetery of Ash from far earlier, except here it's dark as hell and far more dangerous enemies lurk in the shadows. Instead of your fairly conventional hooded hollows from before, now Grave Wardens stalk the ruins. A very popular choice of weapon in Dark Souls 3 is the Sellsword Twin Blades, which are easily obtained near Faron Keep, but if you're after a weapon just like them with additional bleed damage, you can farm these enemies for the Warden's Twin Blades, which is something I did years ago, though the drop rate is really fucking low. It took a while. This first area is really nothing all that special, but I do like the section after the excellent Champion Gundyr fight where the hollows have been replaced with every variant of Black Knight, just like in the kiln of the First Flame from Dark Souls 1. Again though, there's really nothing that new here because you do see Black Knights here or there in other levels too, and the Untended Graves is essentially just an older level with a palette swap and different enemies, but it's the thick sense of unease and dread that pervades the level that I find so compelling, and this feeling is amplified even further upon entering the dark version of Firelink Shrine and talking to the handmaiden there. Her dialogue is creepy as hell and does a great job at hammering home that something here is very wrong and you should probably leave. Despite how much I love these games, I'm actually kind of clueless when it comes to the finer points of the lore, but I've always found the Untended Graves to be a fascinating place when considering the implications it has on the wider story, and that both the regular Firelink Shrine and the Dark one both seem to exist in the same plane of reality. It's not like you teleport to the Untended Graves, you simply walk into it from the Consumed King's Garden. Anyway, I'm rambling here, but to summarise, the Untended Graves is an interesting and effective way of reusing an older level, and I think it's a very interesting level in its own right, even if it doesn't really introduce anything new. Just a couple of entries ago I discussed Dragon's Rest, found within the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, but before that relatively short section, you have to fight through the Dragon's Sanctum. Aesthetically, it's very similar, largely composed of the same stone corridors and rooms, though gameplay wise there's a bigger focus on traps and trap deactivation here. There are many sections in Shulva Sanctum City where you need to hit objects to make parts of the level slide in or out, or up or down, and similar mechanics are present here, though on a smaller scale, like hitting pressure plates to raise or lower spikes, or to rotate a wall to expose an opening, or simply to open up an otherwise sealed door. And these pressure plates can be difficult to spot too, meaning you always need to be looking closely at the environment. It makes for excellent level design that feels rewarding as hell to play through, and it's the kind of thing that makes people so praiseworthy of the DLCs when compared to many of the levels from the base game. I'll take the Dragon Sanctum over fucking Brightstone Cove Seldora any day of the week. But on the other hand, the DLCs did also introduce places like the Cave of the Dead, the memory of the Old Iron King, and the frigid outskirts, so perhaps our praise of the DLCs should be appropriately tempered. I actually used to really dislike the Dragon's Sanctum, but that's because of a misunderstanding I had with another of its mechanics, this time related to the enemies, the Sanctum Knights. They originally appear in ghost form, where they're ridiculously tanky and just a nightmare to take down, and there are a bunch of these dudes scattered throughout the level. However, each ghost has a corresponding altar which, upon being destroyed, will render the Sanctum Knight fully vulnerable, and it'll stay like this even if you die and respawn. No idea how I missed this pretty obvious mechanic. I mean, the fucking altars are glowing red, for Christ's sake, but hey, never mind. I know now, and I think it's really great. It can even be worth doing a wild run through the level just to destroy all the altars so that the place is more manageable to get through the second time round. Good level with good mechanics, though I do think Shulva Sanctum City directly before it is a bit better. Mogwyn Palace is a bit of an outlier when compared to almost every other Elden Ring level in this list, in that it's kind of like two levels in one. First you have the large, open blood swamp section where you can even ride Torrent around, but then there's the mausoleum which plays out more like a regular level, and where Torrent is not permitted. I've always found the blood swamp section to be absolutely chaotic. Sadly, with it being a very late point in the game, there isn't a single unique enemy type to be found here. Yes, they do have a bloodier palette swap, but that's about it, and so expect a hell of a lot of Albinorics here, though they can be deceptively dangerous when they start cartwheeling around the joint, despite their rather foolish, froggy appearance. As much as I do love Elden Ring, I can find myself feeling a wee bit fatigued by this point in the game, and so I tend to have rather little desire to thoroughly explore the level, instead preferring to just ride through, dodging Albinorics and colossal skeletons to collect some of the items along the way before riding to the mausoleum. While I often can't be arsed with the blood swamp, there's no denying that it looks pretty freaking gnarly, though I have a bit less enthusiasm for the mausoleum. Traversing through this portion feels a bit more conventional and uninteresting, and the overwhelming presence of exploding putrid corpses really doesn't do much to make it feel particularly engaging, because these don't really feel like interesting enemies, they feel like walking hazards to be avoided. The Sanguine Nobles are extremely cool though, especially the way they rise out of the ground from pools of blood, but even so, this is another level I usually just feel like sprinting through so as to get to Moog, though not before grabbing the sombre ancient dragon smithing stone and then getting absolutely annihilated by 20 Albinorics. Worth it. For as downright dangerous an area as it may be, you can access the catacombs extremely early on if you're bold enough. In fact, you can descend down into its dark, bony depths before even setting foot in the Undead Burg if you really want, though short of doing a dash through it to pick up some treasure and weapons, the catacombs is best left till later on. There's just way too much stuff that can kill you down here. Personally, I almost always wait until after getting the Lord Vessel. Then I go down, so that after beating Pinwheel I can go directly down into the Tomb of the Giants, but on my latest playthrough of the game I tried going down much earlier, before even visiting Blighttown, and I regretted pretty much every minute of it. I died so fucking much, particularly to the Bone Wheels just before Pinwheel, and even after beating the boss, you just need to double back to Firelink's Shrine anyway, because you can only proceed so far without the Lord Vessel. All that grumbling aside though, the Catacombs is a good level that is remarkably intricate. I've lost count of how many times I've passed through it, but I swear there's still parts of it that I've never even seen, and it took a good few playthroughs before I came across Blacksmith Vamos, because there's just a lot of well hidden shit down here, not to mention well guarded shit. The number of skeletons can get really overwhelming, so much so that it can be difficult to even run by them, though I do like the mechanic where the skeletons will actually stay dead after the associated necromancer is defeated, and I also like how the necromancers don't respawn, making it that bit easier to wade through the sea of skeletons on subsequent runs through the level. The bone wheel bit at the bottom is pure cancer though. I have no love for these things. They stink here and they stink in the Painted World. They did later bring these enemies back in both Dark Souls 2 and 3, but only briefly in either case, and they weren't as overpowered there. Let's continue on with another Dark Souls 3 level, and a fairly early game one too, coming right after the High Wall of Lothric, after being flown in with the help of those Anor Londo demons. The High Wall was a sizable opening level in its own right to be sure, with loads of exploration, optional sections to explore and alternate routes through the level, but honestly, I think the Undead Settlement has to have it beaten in size and even complexity, though perhaps its rough and rickety aesthetic lends itself to how intricate it feels when you're moving through it. An awesome detail right from the very start is how you can clearly see the giant archer in the distant tower, firing arrows down upon the undead villagers. I guess this might have been obvious to a lot of people, but I'm not exaggerating when I say I never noticed that he's visible here until like my 7th fucking playthrough or something. Speaking of the undead villagers, they are of course the most common enemy type here, and there's a hell of a lot of them too, though unlike the Crucifix Hollows in the Road of Sacrifices, I find these enemies to be much more enjoyable to fight. In fact, their animations kinda remind me of the Yarnamites from Bloodborne, albeit with much less personality. This is also the first time you'll see an Evangelist, whose design is taken straight out of Berserk. Definitely one of my favourite Dark Souls 3 enemies, especially with her downright terrifying dialogue as she immolates herself before going in for a motherly hug. Huge level though, and pretty early on you're presented with two completely different routes to take through it. Either forward through the rotten town, or across the bridge and into the barn where swarms of thralls await. As an enemy, the thralls are fine with an interesting enough design, but they do appear a tad too frequently in Dark Souls 3, which is why it always confused me why FromSoft essentially just gave them a reskin and then brought them back for Elden Ring, except they're called imps there. If it wasn't for the imps, I might even have placed the subterranean shunning grounds a few places higher, but alas, here we are. The Undead Settlement is a bit of an anomalous level for me to talk about because when I take all of its excellent attributes into consideration, and the many great moments like when you make peace with the giant archer, or take down the flaming demon alongside Sigurd, or the formidable new enemies it introduces, it seems like a level that I should love, perhaps deserving of a spot in the top 30 rather than the top 80, but you know what? I just don't really love it. I love the High Wall of Lothric, and I love the Cathedral of the Deep, but the bit in between with the Undead Settlement and the Road of Sacrifices, meh. Well, although they're far from bad, and although they tick a lot of the right boxes, they kinda leave me feeling a bit hollow. For the vast majority of Dark Souls 2 players, the Forest of Fallen Giants will be their first proper level out of Majula, though I have been known to pay my respects to the Tower of Flame beforehand, because I love the Tower of Flame. But as for the Forest of Fallen Giants, my position is that while I don't have a great deal of affection for it, I do respect it enough, especially as an early game area. The start is actually pretty freaking brutal, to be honest, because you've got one of those massive ogres on the prowl who are dreadful to fight at the best of times, but a goddamn nightmare when your ADP is really low, and plus you only start with one Estus flask, so not fun times. I remember getting Dark Souls 2 the day it came out, expecting to already be a pro at the game after having finished the first game a bunch of times, but then I got to the Forest of Fallen Giants only to spend the next 25 minutes dying at just this starting area, either to the ogre or to the groups of infantry. I sucked. After this though, the level becomes quite impressive with how some sections branch out, and with the optional parts, like the cave with Kale the Cartographer, or that bit with mild-mannered Pate. I also really like how certain portions of the level are locked off until after you beat the last giant who drops the soldier's key, allowing you to not only progress onwards to fight the pursuer unless you manage to nail him earlier, that is, but also access further optional sections like that dark corridor with the skeletons which spits you out at a different outdoor section with a fucking army of ironclads. Perhaps if the Forest of Fallen Giants didn't have quite so many ambush encounters, I'd like it a bit more, but for an early game level there are some parts with an awful lot of enemies that aren't too much fun to play through. Even on my most recent playthrough, I was surprised at how many times I died here at the start, but ambushes aside, you could do a lot worse than the Forest of Fallen Giants. There's some cool places, treasures and characters here that really reward you for exploring. And right off the back of the Forest of Fallen Giants, we have another level that I actually look upon very similarly. And in fact, we even get to the level directly after the forest, though there is an alternate route to the Bastille from No Man's Wharf, which starts you off at a completely different part of the level. Although I've placed the Lost Bastille just ahead of the Forest of Fallen Giants, in truth I don't really think one is much better or worse than the other, and so consider numbers 70 and 71 to be interchangeable. This is another large level, though instead of being a bright green forest, it's a dismal, sprawling dungeon. Largely populated by royal swordsmen, dogs and rupturing hollows, though if you start off with the part after you fly in from the forest, then one of the first enemies you see is an undead jailer whose design heavily inspired the brick trolls from Bloodborne, which came out just 1 year after Dark Souls 2. To be honest, while I do find it really interesting and pretty damn cool that there are two totally different ways of getting to the Lost Bastille, I don't quite understand why they did this. It's a nice feature and all, but it just feels unnecessary. I remember finally making it to the end of No Man's Wharf, beating the Flexile Sentry and activating the ship to who knows where, only for it to take me to a level I'd already been to and explored hours ago. Also, a really weird aspect of the score of the First Sin version of the game is that it straight up just gives you the dull ember right from the start, which I just don't understand. In the vanilla version, you only found this key item later on in the Iron Keep, and then had to return it to Macduff so as to be allowed to infuse weapons with different elements. It was just a simple wee side quest. But in Scholar, they just give it to you immediately upon entering the level from the forest. I mean, you might as well just do away with the item altogether if you're just going to hand it to me on a silver platter. An aspect of the Scholar of the First Sin version that I absolutely love though is how frequently the Pursuer turns up. The Pursuer is one of my favourite bosses in the game, and I just love fighting him, either in a boss arena or out in the field of battle. And so every time I saw this cursed knight rising out of the ground in a cloud of dark mist, I was thrilled. I counted 4 separate instances of him appearing throughout the Lost Bastille, though it's possible that I missed another occurrence or two. because this level really is pretty damn sizable with a bunch of hidden sections that are very easy to skip over if you're not exploring very thoroughly. As with many of Dark Souls 2's levels, it also introduces a couple of new characters, one being Lucatiel of Mirror and the other being Strayed of Olafis, who's just a delightfully unapologetic dickhead for no reason. Fuck you, Strayed, but also you're pretty cool, I guess. The Artorias of the Abyss DLC starts out with a fierce battle against the Sanctuary Guardian and then onto the Sanctuary Garden, where our beloved mushroom grandmother Elizabeth awaits. But just ahead of this in the Royal Wood is where the exploration aspect of the DLC truly begins. Mind you, it's not like the Royal Wood is a completely fresh new level, because the area you're exploring here is supposed to be the past version of Darkroot Garden, with different inhabitants and a more fragmented terrain in many places, and also a big dragon flying around, let's not forget that. For as unexpectedly charming as I've always found the gardener enemies to be with the way they just go about their business when you're not around, tending the land and idly snipping away at trees with their tools, I've never totally loved actually fighting them, though I've also never found the bush enemies of Darkroot Garden to be all that fun either. The Stone Guardians, on the other hand, are one of the coolest enemies in the game. Big, heavy, chunky visual design and a huge weapon with earth-shakingly impactful strikes. They do a lot to make the Royal Wood an engaging place to explore. Although the Royal Wood is heavily based on Darkroot Garden, I've always found it to feel way different to move around in, to the extent that if I hadn't been told that it was based on an earlier level, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell. Its open landscape also makes it feel very different from most other Dark Souls levels, especially the more constricted, winding ones like the Undead Burg and the Painted World, and it makes it feel quite unique to explore, collecting pieces of the Stone Guardian set, fleeing from farmers, and moving ever closer towards the legendary boss fight with Artorias. A big portion of Bloodborne is actually completely optional, like Old Yarnum, the Healing Church Workshop, Hemwick Charnel Lane, the Nightmare Frontier and Forsaken Castle Cainhurst, and as well as that we have Upper Cathedral Ward, accessible via the Healing Church Workshop, after grabbing the quite well tucked away key in Yahar'gul. The opening beats are quite dazzling because although it has Cathedral Ward in its name, this level is very different in character and atmosphere compared to the ground level. Speaking of which, you can see down to the ground from this bridge to that central section with the Chapel Giants. Enemy wise, there are a couple of church servants at the start and one with a sweet blue scythe guarding the entrance, but one of the most anomalous aspects of the level are the multitudes of crawling celestial larvae, with this being the only place in the game where they appear. Although they can attack you, you really shouldn't ever be taking damage from them unless you were really asking for it. But rather than this making me think less of them as an enemy, it kind of makes me appreciate them more. It's like having a moving decoration which can harm you if you let it, but is more there to be observed and to set the level apart from all the others. The actual interior is a bit less fun and interesting though. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a gimmick level, but it's for sure the darkest place in the game, with a whole lot of brain suckers roaming around, not to mention the blue-eyed variants of the Scourge beasts which are unique to Upper Cathedral Ward. Of course, this is not the first place you have seen the brain suckers, though in all other levels they only serve as isolated tricky enemies at creepy corners of various levels, but here they're the main enemy, and thanks to their ability to paralyse and the pervading darkness, it makes for some tense and occasionally obnoxious encounters. Never mind all the bloody enemies though, never mind all the sucking and fucking.
And he's much better at sucking and fucking.
Because my favourite moment in this level is when you step into the outdoor area and see the standing corpse frozen in the make contact gesture beneath that livid purple sky. One of the things Bloodborne does best is bloody, messy, visceral, bestial combat, but another thing it does extraordinarily well is that creepier cosmic horror, that more anomalous horror concerned with what might lurk in the outer spheres, and the best level at presenting this is Upper Cathedral Ward, with its constant atmosphere of ambiguous weirdness, complemented superbly by its eerie soundtrack. At number 68, I have picked the Ritual Path from Demon's Souls, the second level of the Shrine of Storms. The first level of the Shrine of Storms is quite a goddamn spectacle, and especially distinctive when compared to the rest of the worlds, though I guess you could say that about every Demon's Souls world. Whereas most of that first level places you in bright outdoor sections though, the second is far more dark and constricted in nature, though it does have parts where you briefly step outside again before instantly wishing you were back inside after a close encounter with a pair of golden skeletons, obnoxiously complemented with a few magic projectiles from a nearby storm beast. The final part of the level is what's most burned in my mind because as far as I know this is the best soul farming spot in the game, and also you can farm the Reapers for Moon Shadestone. Demon's Souls really isn't a game where you should have to do much soul farming if any, but it certainly does feel gratifying taking out just one enemy and having everything else in the area die too. Another thing that makes this first part so memorable is the encounter with Patches, with this being the very first instance of getting absolutely booted down a hole. Look at Patch's dumb face here. Jesus, I hate his face. He literally looks like the woman from that meme. I think most people are all on board with this part of the level, but it's the parts afterwards that I know a lot of folk have a bit of a problem with, having you fight more Reapers and Shadow Workers, and there's even one that can go invisible. Even though it can be a pain, it's really not that bad, especially when you get so well rewarded by killing the Reapers, and so I've never had much of a problem here. Also, the room with the phosphorescent slugs is probably in my top 10 list of most beautiful Soulsborne areas. This room is absolutely stunning to look at, especially in the remake, and even though you can simply sprint straight through it and onto the old hero if you want, I think it does a lot to make the ritual path more memorable as a level. What is a bit of a shame is that there is not a single shortcut anywhere in the level, meaning that if you die, gotta play through every inch of it all over again, which can get rather grating. So just warning you, the next 3 entries are from Elden Ring and they're all very similar, being castle levels. Usually castles are exactly my thing, but the game does have a few that, while still being decent enough, aren't quite up to my usual standards. Anyway, at number 67 we have Stormvale Castle, which is commonly agreed to be one of the weakest levels in Elden Ring. This level sucks, pathetic. Just joking, calm down. At number 67 we have Redmane Castle, the minor legacy dungeon leading up to the intense boss fight with Radahn, Scourge of the Stars. Redmane Castle was a confusing one for me on my first playthrough because if you come here too early there is no option to fight Radahn, but then you get to play through the castle as normal. The bridge to the castle is fiercely guarded by scores of Redmane soldiers and a troll, and conditions inside are just as intense with both knights and soldiers defending the battlements, towers and base, and there's even an abductor virgin prowling around. This was actually the very first time I'd seen one of these enemies on that first playthrough, and I loved how it just slowly wheeled from around the corner, very intimidating stuff. But the boss here is just a double fight against a Crucible Knight and a Leonine Misbegotten, and then the level's done. If you come back later though, after progressing far enough through Ranni's questline, telling E.G. about Jeren, or simply after reaching the Altus Plateau, then the castle becomes completely devoid of enemies, and a lot of it is inaccessible, in that you no longer have the ability to even open doors, and it's pretty weird. This is all in anticipation of the Radahn festival of course, but still it's never quite sat too comfortably with me how the level was treated here, and then after beating Radahn, if you come back later, the castle's back to its original guarded state, all a bit odd. Number 67 out of 147 really ain't a bad placement in the list, but the reason I don't have Redmane Castle somewhat higher is that it doesn't feel all that different to the other castles in the game. If you took away all the adornments like the hanged soldiers and hanging weapons, then it'd be difficult to tell it apart from places like Castle Morn and Castle Sol. And speaking of which, presenting Castle Sol. This is an optional minor legacy dungeon in a distant corner of the mountaintops of the Giants, though it is mandatory if you want to pay a visit to the consecrated snowfields and beyond, being the place where the second half of the Haley Tree secret medallion is kept. The opening beats of the castle on the journey make for pretty awesome moments, because you'll need to do battle with a Deathrite bird before arriving here, and also right outside the castle is a walking mausoleum, always nice to see. And then inside you're greeted with not 1, not 2, but 3 lion guardians. Actually, no, there's only 2 of them, sorry. The interior of the castle does feel sort of desolate though, in a sense, with the fact that the main enemies are ghost type creatures, being able to teleport around and stuff, though there are some bothersome animals roaming around too. While this is a solid enough castle level, the only thing that really differentiates it from the other castles is that it's snowier and with more ghosts. But again, just like with Redmane, it feels kind of interchangeable, and this isn't helped with the fact that there's nothing new here. None of the enemies are really new. You'll have seen a number of the Lion Guardians by this point, and even the level boss is just a more challenging reskin of Commander O'Neill. And so while I do like the concept of this remote castle and its snowy atmosphere, I tend to get a wee bit fatigued actually exploring it. And here we have yet another minor legacy dungeon castle from Elden Ring, Castle Morn, found on the southernmost tip of the lands between on the Weeping Peninsula. I somehow nearly entirely missed the Weeping Peninsula on my first Elden Ring playthrough, and only really discovered it after I saw someone mention it in some comment section and had no idea what they were talking about. Though to be fair, you never actually need to even set foot in the region, and nor are you ever really directed towards it. Right after crossing the Bridge of Sacrifices, you will come across Irina, a blind young woman who asks you to visit Castle Morn, further to the south, to convince her father to leave his post now that the servants have rebelled, killing their masters and piling their bodies high. Indeed, upon getting to the castle, conditions are pretty goddamn grisly, with hordes of hideous misbegotten creatures having butchered nearly all the humans, save a few remaining soldiers on the higher levels, and Irina's father who, despite the surrounding carnage, seems like quite a nice chap. Again, actually traversing the castle all feels quite familiar for the most part, though at the same time you'll almost certainly encounter Castle Morn long before getting to Redmane Castle or Castle Sol, and so things still feel quite fresh and interesting at this point. Especially in the later portion of the level where you climb down onto the beach with the jellyfish and the giant crab before doing battle with the Leonine Misbegotten who's guarding the castle's relic weapon, the grafted greatsword, the design of which I've always thought looked kind of dumb, to be honest, even if the idea of it is pretty cool. Just like the previous two castles I've discussed, Castle Morn is a decent level with some interesting attributes, but it's just not quite distinctive enough to make it into the big leagues. We're back with another Demon Souls level, though this is the first one I've mentioned so far that's from my favourite of the game's 5 worlds, that being Boletaria, and the level is the King's Tower, culminating in a fierce encounter with Old King Allant. The level's shortness really is the only reason why I haven't placed it higher too, because there's some really great moments packed in here. You start off fighting the Black Phantom, human versions of Boletaria's 3 other demons, one wielding a tower shield, of course meant to represent the Tower Knight, one with a penetrating sword meant to represent the, you guessed it, Penetrator, and one with a white bow who is meant to represent the Phalanx, somehow. Really great encounter, especially the way it all takes place just ahead of the skewered bloody body of a dead dragon. From here you've got the stairs section that's damn lousy with Red Knights which, despite how much more complex and intense the movesets of these games would get in the future, still intimidate the hell out of me, but from this point in the level onwards it gets far less conventional and even, dare I say, gimmicky with how the focus becomes to time your way through the bursts of dragon fire. I briefly and bravely endeavour to take down the blue dragon here with a few arrows from my white bow before realising that I'd literally be here for about 10 to 15 minutes, just like with the bear bug from the Tunnel City and just like with the red dragon from the Lord's Path. I don't think I'll bother. As for the next dragon section, it's a rare example of a moment that I love, but I also think is shit. It looks fucking incredible, especially in the remake, and it's a scene that FromSoft would later repeat to an extent with the Dragon Bridge in Dark Souls 3. However, what doesn't look so good is Bjorn aimlessly strafing left and right, just allowing himself to be bathed in flames and doing nothing to attack despite clearly being armed with a crossbow. And it's also funny how he only takes 13 damage per hit. It all just feels quite off, and it feels even more so with how stunning the remake looks, because the enhanced visuals magnify the shortcomings of the game's AI, which of course received no enhancement in the remake. And apart from an encounter with Ostrava, that's about all there is to the King's Tower. It's not a large level, but it is dense with great combat and these roaring draconic scenes, and I like it. Well, here we go with one that I'm sure might come as a surprise to many with its quite favourable placement, because it is literally one massive poison swamp. It's the king of poison swamps, and what's more is that your mobility is slowed down at the thicker parts of it. As such, I completely understand why some people would detest it, particularly if the presence of even a modestly sized poison swamp is a deal breaker for you. But myself personally, I think Farin Keep is pretty great. For a start, this level is absolutely massive and filled to the bloody brim with treasures and secrets and poison, yes, but think of all the riches. I'll be honest and say that yes, it can be very difficult to navigate your way around Faron Keep, perhaps even more so than other confusing Soulsborne levels like the Nightmare Frontier and Forbidden Woods, because most of this level isn't even composed of paths, but rather it's mostly very open, and so the main features that help tell one section apart from another are the ruins, trees, enemies and the raised sections leading to the flames which must be snuffed out to open the way forward to the Abyss Watchers. Even so, I kind of like getting lost here, and I like how it really leans into the whole poison swamp thing, because despite how brown and grey and sludgy and slimy it all looks, I think it still succeeds in looking really great with the weird growths hanging from the trees and the roaming packs of monsters and beasts. The level is dangerous as hell for sure. These three enemies are only to be found in Faron Keep, and they make for some of the most intense encounters in the game. For a start, they have great range, but even when their attacks whiff, a bunch of homing red skull things get sent out, executioner glove style, and so while you're dodging the projectiles, the monster is gearing up for its next attack. As well as these things though, there are a lot of Grus, who I'm not quite so big a fan of, though they can certainly be a challenge, especially the unarmed ones who like to go in for that crazy grab attack. It's the wee hidden parts of Faron Keep that really elevate it for me though, like how you can find the body of Elizabeth from Dark Souls 1 and get the golden scroll and Dusk's set, and then there's that crazy bit with the 3 tree monsters who I didn't actually fight in this footage because I was too afraid, but they drop the black bow of Faris from Dark Souls 1 and Faris' hat, which I think is pretty damn neat. I'm not saying I love the act of actually navigating my way around the swamp, especially when you're just trying to locate the 3 flames to open the door and can't find the last one, but despite its elements which lead to most folk not liking it, I think there's quite a lot to like here. You know me, I love a good castle level. Old Candle Type 1A digs a castle or two, and indeed after passing through the Shrine of Winter, you emerge out on the other side to see Drangleic Castle in the distance, making for a rather impressive and intimidating sight. Not as impressive as Anor Londo from the first game, no, but still pretty cool castle, and a particularly well guarded castle too, may I say, guarded by Mastodons, Royal Swordsmen and Cyan Knights, one of whom must be defeated near to each of the 2 golem statues so as to imbue them with their soul to open the castle door. Conditions within the castle are initially rather calm, and there's even the Chancellor here to welcome you, who, by the way, you need to engage in dialogue with 9 fucking times before he'll let you buy stuff from him, which is a hell of a design decision. Many levels in Dark Souls 2 have their quirks or gimmicks, and I guess Drangleic Castles is that it's filled with statues, many of whom will come to life as you walk by, meaning you always need to be on your guard, though this is used somewhat interestingly in the hall with the 6 golem doors where you can pick which door you want to open by killing an enemy near one, except there's a bunch of ruined sentinels behind them, which as you can imagine can get profoundly problematic. I guess shit like this is what makes Drangleic Castle quite interesting and engaging to get through. It's that there's really nothing that conventional about it. It's filled with deceptions, living statues, bizarre trap rooms, pools of acid, paintings that curse you just by standing near them, the executioner's chariot horse again, and a long, long elevator. Moving through it does feel a little bit jarring at times because it doesn't exactly have the most believable layout for a castle, but it's always interesting with lots of enemy variety and engaging level mechanics. The Catacombs of Carthus ranked fairly low in my list at number 116, and while the main reason for this was its rather tiresome grid-based layout, its general aesthetic also didn't do all that much to inspire me. But after taking down Wolnir and emerging out of the catacombs, you enter out into the most stunning level in all of Dark Souls 3. It's Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. As soft and glimmering as this ethereal lunar scene may be though, the reality of Irithyll is far harsher, and this is something that is nearly immediately hammered home when you cross the bridge into the city, triggering a brutal encounter with a Sylvan beast. Even when I know this thing is coming, it still scares the shit out of me. I have to be totally honest here. I must be honest. I think Irithyll looks significantly better than it actually plays. I definitely think it's a good level, but I don't think it's great. Certainly not as great as I expected after seeing how great it looked. It's another one of those cases where it's a bit hard for me to pin down exactly why this is, but I think the main choice of enemy might have something to do with it. The point of knights and witches are excellent, very swift and challenging with long sweeping combos, plus ranged projectiles to add to the pressure of combat encounters when you're fighting more than one at a time, but I'm really not a fan of the semi-invisible enemies all over the place. Yet again we have a case where there's a lot of them and their movesets aren't interesting enough to make them enjoyable to fight, and so I saw them more as nuisances who kept getting in the fucking way when I was trying to nail the actually decent enemies and just get through the level, through the streets and cramped alleys. Still, there are some really great moments here, like when you drop down onto the shallow lake, which again looks fantastic, and if you didn't kill the Sullivan's beast on the bridge, then it will flop down onto the lake and stalk you down here. I think the second portion of Irithyll, just before Anor Londo, is a bit more enjoyable than the first with all the trolls, some of whom are asleep while others are stone dead. This makes for a pretty awesome combat scene, especially with the inclusion of the two Drang fighters, though the mass of deacons sending fireballs at you from above is kind of irritating. Never have been a big fan of the whole concept of keep moving or you will take damage and or die. When you first get to Anor Londo, while the entrance to the Duke's archives is tantalisingly close, it is in fact sealed off by a barrier of golden light, but after getting the Lord Vessel from my sweet queen, and then placing it back in Firelink Shrine, the golden barriers are removed, and the residence of Seath the Scaleless can be entered then explored. It makes for a pretty intimidating entrance too, as you're set upon by the other two of the game's 3 Fangbores, though these ones can't be backstabbed, which ends up making them far more awkward to deal with. The actual interior of the archives makes for a very inspired and potentially confusing level with its focus on navigation via the revolving staircases. I have to admit that I got hopelessly lost in here back in my very first playthrough, before eventually finding my way forward towards the Crystal Caves, though the presence of the Crystal Hollows everywhere certainly didn't help me in my efforts towards finding the exit, particularly when they were buffed up by a channeler. Have to say, I'm really not a big fan of this hollow variant. Thematically they're very appropriate for the level, but I just think they look a wee bit lame, especially when compared to the much cooler crystal golems nearby. The channelers are great though. I mean, they can be pretty annoying, sure, but if they weren't here in the Duke's archives, this place would have far less personality. Of course, they went and repeated the teleporting enemy idea to some extent in Dark Souls 3 and the Grand Archives, though the Crystal Sage in that level is way more of a pain in the arse than these channelers. The level does do one weird thing I've never quite been on board with though, when it nearly forces you to get killed by Seath before transporting you to the prison upon death, whereupon you can work your way down, defeating the fish maidens along the way. I know that's not their actual name. And then grab the key and then get out. The prison section is fine, but it's the forced death part with Seath that's the real dick move. If you have a Ring of Sacrifice on, all good, but if it's your first time playing the game, how would you know? And yes, you can actually exit back out the fog wall, but considering you can't do this anywhere else in the game, and considering that you won't yet understand that this is an unwinnable encounter, why would anyone try to back out the fog wall? I'm all for high difficulty, but I'm not quite so big a fan of unfairness, though I shan't belabour the point anymore, it's not like it ruins the game or anything. Compared to Lost Izalith and the Tomb of the Giants, the Duke's Archives is a significantly better level, though it doesn't quite reach the heights, or should I say depths, of New Londo. I think the Iron Keep is a pretty great level, but something that always made it that bit more enjoyable for me is how much better it is than the levels directly before it, those being Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak, and neither of which I am a fan of. But all that poison gets washed away as you ascend the lift to the Iron Keep, a fortress of fire and steel. Way back in last place at number 147, I had the memory of the old Iron King, a level which I consider to be irredeemably terrible. However, if you were to ask me which other Dark Souls 2 level has the most in common with it, I'd probably say the other shitty optional DLC areas, which also ranked terribly. But I'd also say Iron Keep, because this level is also lousy with Alon Knights and Alon Captains, and they are just as nimble and dangerous. The main difference is the Iron Keep has an actual layout with interesting enemies and mechanics and secrets. I absolutely must mention the Scholar of the First Sin though. See, back in vanilla Dark Souls 2 and before the DLCs were out, the Iron Keep was probably my favourite level in the game. I loved its aesthetic and layout, and for as much as they would later piss me off in the memory of the old Iron King, the Alon Knights are a fantastic enemy, but when I played the Scholar of the First Sin version and got to the Iron Keep, oh boy was I not prepared for what they'd done to the place. This was always a difficult area with a lot of enemies, but there are so many fucking knights in here now. I'm talking way too many, and that's not a good thing. See, personally, when I first get to any level, I'll always try and clear it conventionally, progressively taking out the enemies and exploring and collecting the items and stuff, and if I die, then I'll just try again. But if I succeed in doing all that, and then die to the boss, well, like fuck am I going to play through the whole part before the boss conventionally again. I want to make a beeline for the fog wall, but then Dark Souls 2 says no no no. And then Scholar of the First Sin went no 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 no. We shall make it so that there are so many enemies that it's only barely feasible that you can run through the place alive. And let's not forget that there are no iframes when opening doors or passing through fog walls. Anyway, I didn't mean for this to turn into a larger critique of the game or anything, but my point is that they made Iron Keep way more of a ball ache than it needed to be. It's not insanely hard or anything, but now it just hurts more than it ought to, more than it used to, and that's a shame. Even so, I still think the Iron Keep is pretty sick, especially the vanilla version, and I always look forward to making it here. We're right back to Demon Souls again, and it's the other level from Stonefang Tunnel, the smithing grounds. Being from the same world, the level does of course share many of the same attributes with the Tunnel City, which follows it, boasting the same stone-scaled minor enemies, complemented by the occasional fat official, though what I prefer about the smithing grounds is that it's not quite so labyrinthine. There aren't so many tight tunnels, and nor is there any perilous jumping from ledge to ledge to get down to the bloody boss. Regarding those minor enemies, I've actually never been a great lover of fighting them, because using anything other than magic or a weapon with pierce damage feels awful. I mean, you should definitely have at least one Mailbreaker in your inventory by this point from the gates of Boletaria, but even so, I've never liked how I'm heavily encouraged to switch from whichever weapon I want to upgrade to use a Mailbreaker. And there are tons of these minors too, plus they're very dangerous in groups, and that's why I find it so deflating when I take the time to deal with them, only to get literally 3 souls per kill. That sucks. It's really not the actual enemies that make the smithing grounds for me, though I am partial to a fat official or two. But rather it's the level design. It just plays really well with its elevator shortcut that also allows access down to Ed below, and then you have the molten iron section that you can't initially get to, but then you activate the water mechanism and now that earlier section of the level is accessible. It's all quite conventional, but it feels good and makes the level feel satisfying to move through. And while I'm not the biggest fan of the minors, another aspect of the level that's undeniably satisfying is collecting all those precious upgrade materials. It feels great finishing up the level with a bag full of hardstone and sharpstone shards and then handing them off to Stockpile Thomas because they're taking up about half your fucking storage capacity. After entering into Michaela's Haligtree from the consecrated snowfields and then fighting the true Loretta rather than her spirit like we did before at Caria Manor, you enter a new area which, despite being so damn late in the game, still managed to make me gasp with pleasure. It's Elfale, Brace of the Haligtree. Seriously, the way these flying buttresses and towers over the sea come into view as you descend the stairway is incredible. Sacre bleu. Just the damn scale of this completely optional area, which I'm sure many early players completely missed. There's a bizarre but really interesting juxtaposition of the normal and the putrid found in Elfale, with human knights fighting side by side with putrid avatars, while chambers hosting putrid crystallians lie adjacent to rooms guarded by clean-wrought knights, armed with spears and halo scythes, all while rancid royal revenants stalk the streets below, not to mention the grotesque kindred of rot which lurk deeper within the roots, bathing in pools of red rot. Elfale is clearly incredibly fucked up, as is the case with everything associated with the Scarlet Rot, but even so, it's kind of beautiful, or at least it is on the surface, and to me, that's thematically very compelling. For as interesting as it may be though, the fatigue really can set in once you get here, and that's because enemy-wise it doesn't bring anything new to the table. By this point you've already seen so many soldier variants, clean rot knights, putrid avatars, putrid crystallians and kindred of rot that even though the environment is enjoyable and quite varied to navigate through, the combat isn't all that interesting. Oh, it's difficult, to be sure, unreasonably so in some places, but it's nothing you haven't seen or done already. Also, for as much as I sort of enjoyed the Lake of Rot, just one was quite enough, thanks. I really didn't need another one from Soft. One of the most striking levels in the game for sure, and one with quite a complex layout with its different elevations and its increased focus on platforming when compared to most other legacy dungeons, but I definitely think there was some missed potential here. I discussed Angel River way back at number 110, and while I really didn't have much to say about the level that was particularly negative, it just wasn't noteworthy or impressive enough to score all that favourably. But at the end of Angel River lies the true destination, the other eternal city, and one which you are guided towards by Lunar Princess Rani. It's Noxtella. There were certainly a good few ferocious ants in the cave system leading up to the city, but here Nox warriors can be seen riding around on the ants as if they were horses, though as Yuli the Witch pointed out in one of her many excellent and informative videos, the ants aren't actually tamed in any conventional sense here, but rather they're under some sort of spell, which can even be broken if you dismount the Nox Rider. Very cool detail. Around half of Noxtella doesn't really differ massively to the Ul Palace ruins and cave system which came directly before it, being home to more ants, though especially more silver tears, though now with an additional lightning aspect which they did not have in Nokron. But the other portion of the level is far more architecturally refined, with bridges and various chambers. To actually traverse through this portion really is very straightforward, but it looks absolutely stunning, especially against the gorgeous backdrop, looking very cosmic and astral thanks to the concentration of glowing, twinkling particles suspended in the air to resemble a sort of false sky. I'm a really big fan of the enemies in Noxtella too. The Nox enemies are great to fight with their odd, flowing weapons, but even the silver tears are enjoyable to deal with despite just being dumb blobs. And that's because if you nail one, they'll now explode to deal damage to the others surrounding them, which can lead to incredibly cathartic chain reactions of carnage and runes. But then you have the silver spheres, which are unaccountably terrifying to me. There's something about giving a large shape, sentience, and aggression that I really like. It just gets to me when I see this massive thing slowly rolling my way, especially at this bridge which it's basically patrolling, and you hear it before you see it. Too spooky for me, mate, again. Now, historically, I've treated Old Yarnum quite unfairly. I mean, I say historically, but it was actually just a few weeks ago. But again, look, Old Yarnum, I admit that I've been a bit of a dickhead, and I apologise. But even so, I'm not going to put you any higher than number 55, let's not get too carried away here. Even though it seems like a mandatory area with its scale and significance to the larger story of the city of Yarnum, this is a completely optional level. You need to go here if you want to unlock the door to the Healing Church workshop, and if you want to take a trip down into the Chalice dungeons, but it's not at all required to beat the game. Even so, you probably should pay a visit to Old Yarnum because there's a lot of history down here, and despite having been set ablaze who knows how long ago by the powder keg hunters, burning embers are still ubiquitous throughout the ruined landscape, giving the lost city a distinctly smouldering, smoky atmosphere. This is complemented all the more by its beasts who look quite different to the newer wave of beasts plaguing central Yarnum and beyond, with these ones being smaller and more poisonous in nature, though you do see some larger scourge beasts further ahead in the town section. My main gripe with Old Yarnum before was the presence of Jura, who is armed with a fixed Gatling gun atop a distant tower. Don't get me wrong, extremely cool character, though the steps required to actually be able to speak to him in a civil manner are a tad convoluted, but if you deign to advance further into the city despite his warnings to the contrary, he'll begin firing down at you, meaning you really don't have much time or space to explore a lot of the level. Honestly though, this was a pretty lame gripe, because all you really need to do is just climb the tower and kill him, or befriend him after nailing Dark Beast Parel, after which you can grab the items without having to rush around quite so much. Also, Jura isn't present at all in the second portion of the level, which I much prefer to the first. The atmosphere is even thicker and smokier here. Old Yarnum isn't a level I especially look forward to when starting any fresh Bloodborne playthrough, but it's a good bloody level nonetheless, and no playthrough really feels complete without exploring it before taking on the blood-starved beast. By the time you reach the Nightmare of Mensis, it's fairly likely you'll already have visited the Nightmare Frontier a bit earlier, and so you might have a decent idea of what to expect here, but in my humble opinion, the Nightmare of Mensis makes for a far more interesting and varied level. Things do start off rather similar, with the same grey, craggy atmosphere, but it's not long before some actual structures come into view, which is right around the time where you might start to feel a bit alarmed at the fact that your frenzy meter is rapidly building up. And it might not even be initially obvious why. Of course, the elevated distant chamber glowing red is housing the rotten brain of Mensis, the mere sight of which causes your character to take damage and rapidly go mad. And while I may not be the biggest fan of the frenzy mechanic, I simply must concede that this is an awesome use of it. A nice and helpful touch here is that the enemies in the area also take damage, making it possible to bait them out into the open and watch their health rapidly tick down. As for the interior and upper levels of the Nightmare, this is where the level gains even more of a distinctive aesthetic and personality, progressively throwing more nightmare creatures at you, like the dogs whose heads are replaced with that of crows and vice versa. And then there are the boar enemies, except way more terrifying, disgusting and dangerous. And let's not forget the reuse of the Shadows of Yharnam, except not quite as powerful and with none of the serpent nonsense. Of course, the starting outdoor section isn't the only time you need to contend with the frenzy mechanic in this level, because if you choose to explore the optional part of the Nightmare by rowing through the broken window from the left, several winter lanterns are to be found roaming around singing their creepy, creepy song. For the last time, too spooky for me, mate. This is also the general section where you can drop the Brain of Mensis from its chamber and then later get up close and personal with it in the void below. Though here, all its frenzy capabilities are gone. I always found this really weird, but then a commenter on my Bloodborne retrospective from a few months ago pointed out that the brain actually had chains and spikes around it at the top, implying that it was mainly lashing out with frenzy because it was in pain. Kinda makes you feel sorry for it. Kinda makes you want to give it a hug. Maybe not, actually. Although the Valley of Defilement is undoubtedly a miserable and depressing level, swarming with vermin and literally covered in shit, like most of Scotland, I actually don't consider it to be the most disturbing level in the game, because I think that award has to go to the second level of the Tower of Latria, that being Upper Latria. The Prison of Hope directly before it is hardly a walk amongst the flowers, but sweet Jesus, right as you walk out into one of the many dark walkways which make up Upper Latria, the sheer oppressiveness of it, the thick gloom, hits you right in the face. The place looks like a sort of hell, only without the fire and brimstone, though there are certainly a fair share of unspeakable monstrosities lurking about, both above and below. For a start, Upper Latria is a very perilous level. The nature of the elevated terrain means you're never totally safe here, especially when being set upon by a gargoyle if you get too reckless with the dodge rolling. The unfortunate thing about the gargoyles though is that they do not feel good to fight. In other videos of mine I've made it abundantly clear how much I detest the boss of this level, the Man-Eaters, but sadly the similarly airborne gargoyles share some of the same shortcomings when it comes to their mobility, often getting stuck or just straight up standing there and not attacking, and trying to engage them can feel so jarring that I often prefer to just run the fuck past them rather than deal with their bullshit. It's not all about the gargoyles though, because the level itself makes up for it. Now, this really isn't a happy ride as you move through its expanse before descending down into the swamp before ascending back up to the walkways, but even so, it's just a well-designed level. The goal is to interrupt the two rituals which bind the enormous heart at the centre of the map, causing it to drop down from its high point in a very similar fashion to the Brain of Mensis in Bloodborne, now that I think about it. It's essentially the same sort of thing that levels like the Smithing Grounds do, where after reaching a certain point in the level, you can go back to an earlier point which is now fully accessible to grab the treasure and proceed further on into the boss. The whole affair is moody, gloomy, challenging and a bit miserable, but it also makes for a pretty great level. Whereas the Royal Wood was very open and somewhat wild, filled with busy gardeners and roaming stone guardians, kind of like Darkroot Garden, Oolacile Township has more in common with the Undead Burg, except that bit more corrupted, chaotic and unconventional, because here the buildings, streets and stairways have begun the process of sinking and slanting downwards into the abyssal chasm below, and the corruption has also very much spread to the residents of the township. Many levels in Dark Souls boast a thick, distinctive aural ambience, and while somewhat subtle, I think such touches contribute massively to the game's special atmosphere, and much the same is true in Oolacile Township. The place just sounds twisted and wrong, especially when complemented with the weird shrieks and garbled abyssal gibberish and laughter of the Oolacile residents and sorceresses, the latter of which will joyfully attempt to snipe you with powerful dark magic as you tread across perilous planks and sunken stairways. A great touch with this level is how much more corrupted it becomes as you descend further down. Conditions are messed up above, but the lower you go, the more concentrated is the presence of that dark purple sludge of the abyss, and the higher the concentration of enemies waiting in ambush. Although I really like the DLC, I don't quite think it has the best levels in the game, but of the 3 DLC levels, Ulysio Township has always felt the most enjoyable for me to explore and descend, making for an excellent precursor to the Chasm of the Abyss before the final fight with Manus. Canehurst is the most unique level in all of Bloodborne, because whereas Yharnam and its surrounding areas are largely Lovecraft inspired, especially Yahar Ghul and the Nightmare levels, Canehurst is far more inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. Even our method of getting to the castle is eerily similar to that book's main character's journey by carriage to Dracula's mountain castle in Transylvania. Canehurst looks downright beautiful and has such interesting character, both outside and in, with one of its main recurring features being the eerie statues dotted all over the place, which FromSoft would later repeat slightly less compellingly in Elden Ring's Shaded Castle. There are so many great, creepy touches in this place, like how even though you ride a horse-drawn carriage to the castle, when the cutscene ends and you turn around, the horses look to have been dead for months, if not years, and even the bridge leading here is somehow completely destroyed, despite the fact that we just crossed it, though I guess this can be put down to some vile blood illusion, just like the one you later dispel after donning the Crown of Illusions. Canehurst's strongest aspect really is its excellent presentation from beginning to end, and my favourite moment by far is when you first enter the foyer and are greeted by all this absolute splendour, coupled with a servant literally in the process of waxing the floors to keep them shiny. 30 FPS or not, this looks stunning. All that said, for as cool as Canehurst is, it's definitely not my favourite Bloodborne area, and that's because I feel that it's missing some other cool enemy type. Yes, you do have the parades of crying women who attack you with knives, sometimes without their fucking head, but these enemies do more to add to the dark, elegant ambience of the level, rather than being mechanically interesting or enjoyable to fight. There are the gargoyles, but these things are kinda lame, and way too easy to beat, though the little rapier wielding dudes are pretty cool, not that there's that many of them. I think Canehurst could have used an extra bigger, meatier enemy, something like the Tomb Guardian from the Chalice dungeons, or even a stronger variant of the Executioners. That being said, I am quite nitpicky here because they could have just used recycled enemies from other areas, but they didn't. One of my all-time favourite moments from this game and from any FromSoft game is if you choose to lure Alfred over to Canehurst and are greeted by this sorry scene upon paying Annalise another visit. It's crude, gratuitous, horrific and disgusting, and that's why I love it. So, due to the close relationship and similarity between Nokron and Siofra River, I'll be covering them both collectively here, though they are still both their own levels with their own places in the list. A few entries ago I discussed Nokstella, the Eternal City, but before you reach that place, another Eternal City lies deep underground, one with a similarly mystical, mythical and magical feel. It's Nokron. You first get a bit of a glimpse of Nokron from Siofra River far below, as pointed out by Blythe, but it's not until Radahn is defeated, causing the stars to continue their motion and a comet to crash down onto the Mistwood, that the entrance to it is quite literally unearthed. Let's dive in. Elden Ring holds many wonders and areas of breathtaking beauty, but I definitely put Nokron as one of the greatest, particularly upon first entering into it as you're bathed in the purple gloom, traversing over the series of roofs and toppled buildings to descend ever further into the city's depths to uncover its secrets and mysteries. Just like in Nokstella, there are a lot of silver tears around, though here they lack that lightning aspect, meaning they don't explode, sadly. Some tears will transform into other beings though, sometimes a human, even a troll in one case, which looks particularly striking. For as good as this first section of Nokron looks though, the pleasure is mostly in passing through it. As with many other levels in Elden Ring, there are a lot of weaker enemies here which feel more like a chore to fight than anything. I'd say the more enjoyable part of the level is the second portion, Night's Sacred Ground, but this is also where I need to mention Siofra River, which I've placed right next to Nokron in my list, because just as you could earlier explore that level, lighting all 6 pillars to activate the entrance into the Ancestor Spirit boss fight, you can do that up here too, except this time for the Regal Ancestor Spirit, which is a bit more powerful and it also drops a Remembrance. Although optional, it's a really fun aspect of Siofra and gives you a great reason to thoroughly explore the ancestral woods, grabbing all the items and maybe even indulging in a bit of hunting thanks to the unexpected concentration of animals down here, not to mention the many ancestral followers whose forms glow a bright spectral green. But yeah, exact same thing up in Night's Sacred Ground in Nokron, though things are more dangerous up here. Now the ancestral followers appear in their regular form, complete with a new singing female variant, not to mention herds of wolves, led by a particularly dangerous red wolf, essentially the same enemy as the Red Wolf of Radagon back in Raya Lucaria Academy. Siofra River is a fantastic, expansive and beautiful level, and of course, that first descent down into it from the Mistwood in Limgrave is often cited as many players' holy shit moment, as they begin to come to terms with the scale of the game, but there's this whole other expansive world beneath the lands between. As for Nokron, well, although I prefer if it did something to change up the whole lighting the pillars thing, or even replaced it with something else entirely rather than just repeating it, the beginning portion of the level more than makes up for it. This is the first Bloodborne DLC level to appear so far, being one of 3, the others being the Hunter's Nightmare and the Research Hall, both of which are very high in my rankings, though that's not till much later. As for the fishing hamlet, I don't think quite so affectionately about it as I do the other 2, though it still has a very respectable place here at number 48. Each of the 3 Old Hunters levels differ greatly from one another, but none more so than the Fishing Hamlet, which boasts probably the last type of environment that you expect to see after stepping out of the Astral Clock Tower, being greeted with a mud path, shattered ships, and just ahead a ramshackle shanty town of shamans, supersized bipedal sharks, and spear-chucking fishmen. The atmosphere is thick and fishy, so thick you can practically smell it, and indeed there's very little subtlety here. In fact, you're nearly instantly assaulted with legions of enemies and projectiles, and it's very intense. But the intensity is always at its maximum when there's a shark giant in the picture, or 2. These have to be the most terrifying enemy in Bloodborne, though the Nightmare Executioner comes in a very close second. As soon as one gets anywhere near, I always need to fight my initial instincts, those being to just panic dash away to safety, because if you actually stick close, they're really not quite as brutal as they first seem. It's just that they're really, really loud and have long wind-ups to their attacks. You do traverse a few different environments while in the hamlet, such as the deeper cave system and that sort of fishery place. Sorry, I don't know what else to call it. There's a heavy fish theme going on here, though at the same time, not really, because while the inhabitants do exhibit certain maritime characteristics in their appearance, it's actually phantasms they're catching here, not tuna. The mystery surrounding the fishing hamlet really adds to the experience of moving through it, not to mention its importance to the larger Bloodborne story with Bergenwerth and the Hunters, and I love how you can see the dead body of Kos washed up on the beach from way up near the lighthouse before you even set foot in the Orphan of Kos boss arena. It's a fantastic level and I really do like it, but I'd be lying if I said I loved it. It's certainly better than a number of Bloodborne's base game levels, like the ones I've already discussed, but I don't quite enjoy playing through it as much as the Hunter's Nightmare or Research Hall, despite its fantastic new enemies, atmosphere and ambience, and fish. And that will conclude part 2 of this series. We discussed a lot of good levels there, and even some damn great ones, though for a Soulsborne ranking like this, it's really not the case where the bottom 50 suck, and then the next 50 are good, and then the next 50 are great, because I'm talking about some of the best games ever made here, and so the standards are higher, which can also make the levels pretty tricky to rank. Right back before I even began writing up the scripts for these videos, I did of course create my big list, but as I write I am constantly switching levels around, sometimes by just a few places and sometimes by 20 places, until I get to the point where I'm reasonably confident, before probably regretting everything after I put out the video and it's too late now. Anyway, as usual I'm rambling, and so let's end it there. There's only part 3 to go now, and that's going to be an extra fun one because we're talking about the absolute best of the best, and so I sure hope you'll join me again when it drops. Please allow me to give another fond thank you to my kind patrons, and on that note, cheers for watching and cheerio.